Hello and welcome to the Purvis Versus podcast. My name is Eric Purvis. I am an RMT, course creator, continuing education provider, and advocate for evidence-based massage therapy. In this episode, we welcome Walt Fritz, who is a physical therapist from New York, and he's going to tell us about his clinical and educational experiences and how he made the transition from being heavily invested as a MFR-focused therapist into being an evidence-based clinician. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, hello, Walt. Thanks for being here today. It's nice to finally meet you virtually. I know we've chatted on Messenger and stuff before and email, so thanks time for being here.
Thanks for having me.
No, this is great. I think this is gonna be a really good conversation. I know from some of the offline stuff we've had before, I think we are probably going to confirm a lot of biases. We're probably going to say a lot of the same things, but maybe not. Maybe we can have some heated discussions on things, or maybe we can just agree on what needs to be done and how we view the industry that we're in, the manual therapy industry. So I'm looking forward to this. What I wanted to start with, though, is just kind of tell everybody just something about you. Who are you?
Something about me. Well, I'm a physical therapist from New York State. I've been doing this for a long time. Graduated from PT school in 1985, long before physical therapy was even a master's profession, much less the doctorate profession that it is in the United States now. And kind of seeing a lot of trends come and go, and including a lot of trends that I was fully immersed in, and took a while to sort of wash myself clean from those. So I have a practice in upstate New York, 5.5, 6 hours from New York City, more in the country than it is what city living looks like. But I see patients here half time, and I have a fairly robust teaching and traveling schedule and writing and all sorts of good things like that. So how's that for an intro?
No, I've noticed too that you teach a lot. Like you're on the road like almost every second weekend, aren't you?
I am. Yeah.
So how do you manage that? Because I know from my own experience as like being a CE instructor, it's exhausting. So what are your tricks of the trade?
Don't get exhausted. Well, not working full time in my practice, I think that makes a difference, right? I have, like I said, a part-time practice. I don't try to build it up so I'm really packed here, but also, just be comfortable with your content. I think that's a huge part of it. Not that we go in on autopilot, but being comfortable with the content, understanding it, understanding your audience really well. And I don't know. I just that's what I've done now for a long time. COVID certainly put a stop or a change in all that, but I switched things up over the last couple of years in terms of who my target audience is and who I'm trying to be and who I'm not trying to be, and that kind of made it, I think, a lot easier on me, and in honesty, more comfortable and more enjoyable. So. Yeah. Besides that, I don't know. I mean, it's I consider it my job. But it's funny because can your job be your hobby and your enjoyment and your passion too? Some people say, no, you got to separate those two. But I think if you're really drawn into what you do, there is no such thing as work. It's just, getting up to do what you enjoy doing.
Yeah, I love that. I love teaching too. And that's why, I wanted to get you on here, was to hear your take as a CE instructor and kind of your journey, and we'll get into that. But there's nothing more satisfying, I feel, that when you go and you deliver a good workshop and you get great feedback and you feel like you've impacted people and you've changed lives in a positive way. It's like a drug. It can be so, just feels so powerful, and so you're like, okay, what I'm doing is I can stand behind it. I know what I'm doing is helping people, and when that resonates with learners, it's great, isn't it?
It is. And given my background in one of those the rabbit hole modality empires, the power is often through passing along secret science, secret handshakes, all that sort of stuff that a lot of us have either been through or are still involved with. And it kind of my past is, there's a definite delineation where I separated past from present. And now what I'm not trying to do is to wow everybody with, guru medicine, but can I just say, we can be our authentic selves and speak in evidence-based language, patient-centered language, and still have a huge impact on people. And I think that's rather, it's uncommon. I don't want to say rare in our shared communities, because you know what? It's all about the big sell. It's all about the mystery. It's all about the draw, getting people to keep coming, which, you know what? It fills people's bank accounts, and we all need, that's what we do for a living. So I don't totally, disavow that, but I don't know. I just seen a lot of the dark side of that world, and I kind of want to stay away from it.
Well, I don't blame you. It's tough though, yeah, because like you could sell the quick fix, you could sell the magic, and people would fill up your courses, and I've experienced that too when you're trying to sell or get people to attend something that is evidence based. That you're like, this is I can defend everything here with good quality
Hmm.
research. I'm not teaching you any magic tricks. I'm just trying to help to integrate this into your practice and with that kind of patient-centered care, client or person-centered care model. But that stuff's not really like sexy and attractive to the learners because they're always looking for that magic technique, that magic thing that's going to like provide the fix. And it's always disappointing when people are looking for that, and you're like, the stuff that we want to share with you is probably more powerful. It just requires that shift in thinking
Yeah.
and shift in application and communication. And that's hopefully something that people like yourself are getting that shift more noticed or more talked about.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, doing podcasts like this certainly gets my message out, and I appreciate that. And being a big mouth on social media doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
We're up against the people with, let's face it, a big budget, um, years of exposure of their model, and that fan club mentality is just so strong in our shared professions that it's really it's a difficult road to kind of travel. After I left myofascial release, which is my sort of my gateway drug into manual therapy, um, it was difficult for me. I was really trying to sort of fight that and almost compete for that, not the dollar, but the ears of people who are doing MFR or interested in coming into MFR. And basically, it was just sort of saying, look over here, don't look over there. But then it's the realization that it's like, what you gotta, marketing 101 is know your audience and know who you are and who you're not. And that I realized that's not who I wanted to be. That's not what I wanted to attract and draw. And being in this evidence-based, if that's what I call myself, perspective, it's difficult when you've got people just with the ear of a lot of people saying, the only evidence that matters is patients' outcomes and patients' happiness, which, sure, man, that matters. But you can pull a lot of crap on people and tell them a lot of really lousy things. And if they get better from it, if they like you, then they believe everything you said. And I mean, I just see that post hoc fallacy type of a model just like all over the friggin' internet, all over Facebook. It just, yeah, it's frustrating, and I know it's effective marketing. Let's face it. I mean, I fell for it. I don't know your background, Eric, but I'm guessing you fell prey to some of that earlier in your career. I don't know.
Totally, I totally did, and if anyone asks, I'm the first one to say, like, myofascial release was my gateway drug, into kind of pigeonholing how I was thinking about manual therapy. Like as a massage therapist, we learn all these different techniques in school, and then you kind of what happens to a lot of us, at least when I went to school 16, 17 years ago, 20 years ago now, you kind of choose your kind of path. You kind of choose your way you like to work with people,
Mhm.
and I was really drawn to that myofascial narrative. And everything I saw had a fascial connection. Everything I saw was a
Mm.
fascial problem. And I
Yeah.
realized, I wish I could say I realized sooner than later, but let's be honest, it took me a long time to realize that I had blinders on, and I was just everything was a fascia, everything was fascia, 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 fascia. And then when I actually started digging into the science of it and the research that was being used to support it, I realized this is nonsense. This actually doesn't support what you say, or there's a lot of big claims that are being made from tiny little studies that are totally irrelevant. And I felt like I had been lied to, right? Like this kind of very structural fascial paradigm I was working under didn't have anything to stand behind, and I felt so wronged. And then that's how I kind of took a dive into the pain science stuff, which we could probably discuss that too. There is some stuff there too where your pendulum swings totally the other way, and so now you're trying to find that balance. But yeah, for sure, the myofascial stuff was where I came from, and it's been hard to. I don't know what your experience is like as an educator, but it's hard to get people to think outside of that because they've had success.
Yeah, yeah.
People feel
I,
better.
it, it's just it's hard for clients or patients too. They just a myofascial release therapist or craniosacral therapist or fill in the blank of all the other named modalities, right? That person helped them, so then they assumed that it was everything that they said was right. Oh no, my problem was a cranial lesion, and that was why their gentle hands-on touch helped me so much, et cetera, et cetera. And that stuff is really, really difficult to unpack. And it's also, I think it's difficult to unpack for us when we have so much, what do they call it? The time sunk narrative, right? We time and money that we put into this. And you don't, boy, it's really hard when you really see evidence that conflicts with what you were taught, what you believe, and what you want to believe. My whole, great undoing was in 2005 on Soma Simple, where they just like beat the living crap out of me, and I deserved all of it. But I still wouldn't look at what they were giving me in terms of, here's what you might want to look at, Walt, to see that there's other ways to view the work that you do. There's other ways to view how a person responds when we touch them. And it took me a good year after that myofascial release, the great conversation debate, before I had my come to Jesus moment and left that MFR community and really then went back and started looking through a lot of that evidence from that group. And it's been like, I've not looked back since then.
That's actually where sorry, go ahead. No, I was saying that's where I first saw you was on Soma Simple. I never commented on Soma Simple, but I lurked heavy, and I've read the great myofascial conversation or whatever it was, and everything else on that site. And that was such a powerful, important site, such a powerful conversations that were had on there. It was great, and we don't have anything like that now. I mean, that was pre-Facebook. Like I came into that stuff. Probably I first found Soma Simple maybe around 2012, maybe 2013, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me because I was still at that time. I always say that I was curious. I was like evidence curious. So I was like, I knew stuff that I was learning didn't make sense, but I didn't know what the different answer was. So I was kind of left in this place of confusion and didn't know where to go. But I remember someone turned me on to Soma Simple. I remember reading that, and I think it's so great. It says a lot about you as a person too, as an educator, that you're like, yeah, I was totally into this, and then these people just beat the snot out of me, and then I realized, okay, you know what? Maybe I could still do what I do, but I don't have to hold on to this conceptual framework, which doesn't have any support.
Yeah, it's ironic too, because over the last 10 years, man, I've been not exactly a mouse about my, kind of voicing my disdain for all things myofascial, or at least all things myofascial when it comes to that guru-based mentality that it's all about the fascia, the emotions are stored in the fascia, and all that crap. Excuse me for being so crass, but and early this year, I got an invitation from one of these, World Fascial Congresses or something, to present, to teach a course at the fascial, the third, whatever it is. I can post it here, but I emailed the organizer back. It's like, really? Have you actually read my website? Do you follow me on social media? Do you understand that I don't believe that one can select fascia for intervention to the exclusion of a human being? And, in this long email where I went on my diatribe without trying to be too disrespectful, I proposed a talk that goes something like, seeing the forest for the trees, treating the whole person instead of their fascia. And the organizer actually thought it was a good idea to see, the sense of balance. And I'll probably just get sort of virtually booed out of the building because I'm doing it online. I think it's being held in Brazil or something like that. But I think it's important for all of us to see that sense of balance. We do get so unbalanced when we go into these rabbit holes of beliefs, and it's not just in manual therapy, it's in politics, religion, you name it. It's difficult, really difficult to see that the perspectives of the other side.
Yeah. It was a tribal mentality
Yeah,
where one side's
yeah,
right, the other side's wrong, and the side that's wrong must be against me. And
yeah.
we see that. Yeah, I mean, I see it all the time. One of the things that drives me crazy is all like the acronym based kind of learning, because they're all
Mhm.
focusing on a tissue or a very specific approach. And I like what you
Yeah,
said there was there's a person, right? So you can do, and this is a thing I think that gets lost in the translation. Now, tell me your thoughts on this, but this is in my experience, is that you kind of push back on these, let's use fascia, these fascial narratives, and what people hear is that what I'm doing is garbage and isn't helping people.
yeah,
And you're
yeah,
like,
yeah,
that's, I've never said that.
yeah.
You probably haven't said that. Most of us that are trying to
No,
change things or don't say that, but that's the message people hear because you're challenging their way they think, their conceptualization of what their hands-on techniques are doing. I'm like, I'm not saying that, but maybe maybe we can think of a more scientific, a more evidence-based explanation for that.
yeah.
What do you think? What's your experience with that when you're trying to
Well, to
get
be
people out of that?
full disclosure, when I left MFR, there was a time when I basically did all those things that you said. I
No.
yeah, yeah. You talk about pendulum swinging,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then the pendulum slows down, and you get a chance to kind of look around and realize, you're not making any friends. It doesn't do any good. Most people don't respond well to that sort of a confrontation. And if you want to change some minds, or at least start with some fresh minds, I think it takes some politeness, which took me a little while to learn. And it was useful, though. It was useful not just in my education, or the CE model, but in life in general. It took me a long time to kind of work through all the different models that are out there. And I learned a lot of it in PT school. We had a fairly robust background in manual therapy, especially more manipulation and mobilization, but also massage and some deep tissue work. But I had my share of continuing ed in the various manual therapy modalities in the first part of my career. And after I left MFR, I studied. Oh, I was very fortunate to take a class from Diane Jacobs, she was actually the one of the few people on Summa Simple who basically didn't delete any email or message I sent her. She was kind enough and patient enough with me to, I want to call it, holding my hand as I crossed that bridge, instead of just, flicking me off for being rude in that original 2005 conversation. And since that time, I've kind of moved into understanding more about the behavioral science explanations for why what we do can be helpful. And a lot of manual therapists, massage service PTs really take offense when you start talking about contextual factors and other more behavioral neurologic influences that we have when we're one-on-one with a person, that are less about the tissues and less about the skill of our technique, and more about the relationship that we build with people. I tell a story in my classes about what's, if someone could ask you, Eric, if you had to put up one paper, one study, one whatever it is, that basically like nutshells what you believe as a clinician, your approach, etc. Could you do that? Because I know, I thought about that, and so shameless plug. My book came out a couple of months ago, and while I was doing that 3-year process, I went into a lot of other rabbit holes, and I came upon a paper that was written in 1957 by Carl Rogers, psychotherapist Carl Rogers, which obviously has nothing to do with massage, with PT, with manual therapy, or anything. And it was a paper that basically got Carl Rogers ostracized from his mental health profession for a time, because what he was proposing was that positive clinical outcomes in a mental health setting were minimally dependent on the modality that one used, even though at the time the prevailing belief was the modality mattered. That's why somebody got better. It's because of, fill in the blank of whatever intervention you're using, much like, our acronym driven CE world that we're a part of, right? And what what Carl Rogers was proposing was, instead of the modality, it was the relationship that we build with the client that was more pivotal in helping them to, self-discovery, be to basically improving. And to me, that was sort of the embodiment of how I saw myself as a clinician here in my practice, and what I teach to professionals now around the world. That it's about that relationship we build. And sure, we need a story, but I think it helps to have multiple stories instead of, it's all about your fascia. And I'm willing to say, well, it could be about the fascia because some people believe that, but it could be about, the nervous system. It could be about all these different possibilities. But, instead of trying to explain that as the reason, can we do something that you as an individual can appreciate, that it's safe, that it feels effective, that you have input in? And to me, that's sort of the embodiment of Carl Rogers' work that we're bringing forth, here in 2023.
And you said the paper was from the 50s.
1957. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, isn't that
Yeah.
crazy? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny because my background is like I did my undergrad in psychology,
Hmm.
much younger, and it's funny that now that I'm learning more over the last number of years, learning more about the behavioral sciences and learning more about these relationships, it's kind of bringing back all these kind of fundamental things you learn in your undergrad degree, and you start to realize like, oh, if I'd been able to put these things together sooner, I probably would be a lot further ahead. But you don't think that way, right? You're thinking modality, you're thinking fixing, you're thinking tissue, you're not thinking those human relationships. But then when you start to look at those human relationships, you realize like, oh, this makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
There was
much
a
more.
paper that was released early last year, which was a really breakthrough one for me, because in MFR, now I don't know your background in MFR, and we don't need to get into names, but I learned a lot about that emotional holding of fascial restrictions. That until you deal with the fascial restrictions, a person doesn't truly, air quote, heal their emotional baggage that they hold and all that stuff. And there was never a doubt that sometimes when we touched people, I only saw it with MFR, but when we touch people, they often have an emotional connection to that, an emotional memory, sometimes a cathartic type experience, and that was leveraged in MFR to release those emotions, unwind those emotions, and all that. I saw that there was a lot of flawed logic in explaining that, but I didn't really have a great counter argument to that until 2022. There was a paper by the lead researcher was the last name McParlin, and I can share this and you can post it in the show notes if you want.
Yeah,
And it
please.
was from an entire issue of Frontiers in Psychology that was devoted to touch. And in McParlin's article, they talked about touch being able to relate a person, the touchee, if you will, to their priors, how basically the priors relate to the present, right? And priors in a mental health setting are about trying to bring a person to an understanding of why their past relates to the present, right? And what they were doing in the paper, and it wasn't about manual therapy with touch, it was about touch in general, right? Um, but what they were talking about, how the ability of touch to relate a person to their priors, and they talked about an experience that when the touchee and the toucher are basically resonate, if you will, without getting too esoteric with the language. But when I do something with someone that they then can relate that touch to the past, they call it being in synchrony with them. There's a lot of that sort of crosses over into body work narratives, and the whole paper was about interoception, right? The interoception and C-tactile afferents, and our ability to basically fuel into someone's own self-regulating mechanism, which is a whole lot different than me being the fixer of fascia, right? It's basically allowing somebody their own control, which I think is hugely powerful, but it sort of strips us of those ego-based models that we paid so much money and we vested so much into. When if touch can convey the sense of self-regulation, maybe it's not about our magic techniques. Maybe it's just being present in the relationship.
That totally confirms the bias of mine too. I don't remember that magazine article as well as you recited, but I did remember seeing that and buying that Frontiers of Psych magazine. I did read that article at the time, but need to find it probably just to read it again, because I
Yeah,
loved your
well,
description of it, because that
yeah.
great.
Well, for your listeners here, it's now I think the entire journal is available in open access. So you can access not just the article, but a number of other articles by it. And then reading that article gave me some fuel for the book. I had to do an addendum in the book because I was almost done, but it also led me down some rabbit holes to understand, well, just a deeper understanding of a lot of different concepts that sort of tie in that behavior sciences with the physical science. And I think it's hugely impactful and important work for us. We got to come out of our, like you said earlier, blinders, and really open our eyes to see that, we might be touching, and we might have been taught that it's all about a muscle knot or a fascia restriction or a trigger point or whatever. But those are these closeted concepts that we just, as professions, I think it's really time to pack away and move on from.
Yeah, I would totally agree, and that's one thing that I've been a big advocate for many years, is trying to like get the stakeholders in my profession, at least in Canada, to acknowledge that we need to update. Like, our curriculum and our understanding stuff is so behind. And if we look, like, so you said the big fascia debate, that's 2005, and that information that was being shared with you by them 2005, which is 18 years ago now, as of this
Mhm.
recording, and that information that they were talking about then was from like the 90s, a lot of it, and so this information is not new.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
actually old information, but there's such a slow, or almost I don't know, ignorance to adopt it. And yeah, and I agree that what you said, with everything you said there, that the kind of the behavioral sciences and the relationship kind of sciences is really, that's going to inform what we're doing way more than the, like you said, the muscle and the connective tissue stuff, which is important
yeah,
to know.
yeah,
But is it that important? Is it more important than the behavioral stuff? I would say no.
yeah.
There's
And then we have the messiness of outcome-based studies versus mechanism of action studies. And let's face it, it seems like 95% of the studies that people, especially in our kind of closeted Facebook group world, the kind of studies that people like to post are the ones that support myofascial release for neck pain or whatever, right? And you could fill in the blank on, 1,000 different modalities and 100 different disorders, but they all sort of run a similar path. And it's like, fascia is the thing nobody pays attention to, and people say that when fascia gets restricted, it leads to pain, and they get away in a peer reviewed journal with posting that, and then they go into a study which basically says when they did something with their hands that we call myofascial release, the person's neck felt better. Now that validates that the relationship and the thing that person did with their hands, it has nothing to do with fascia, but yet that's basically what fills our journals. And full mechanism of action studies or papers, they're out there, but people don't like them because they're boring. I quote regularly, like Joe Bialosky's 2018 paper on manual therapy effects. A paper in 2019 by Geri, Geri, is one of my favorite, as well as one by 2020 by Kolb, Kolb, which basically says, in manual therapy education, what are we waiting for? We know all these things. Why is our education so stuck in the past and claiming all these tissue-based problem and tissue-based solutions when we know so much more? And those are my three things that I just beat like Don Quixote, and windmills and all, whatever, the story there. But ultimately, it's a tough sell, Eric.
Oh yeah, it is. It's not easy, because it's different. It challenges, right? You're going against the status quo. I love that you said those three papers too, because it's funny, because before we, I'm just looking at them right now. Before we came on, I brought up a couple papers here, and the one that I have in front of me, one of them is the Bialosky, the Unraveling the Mechanisms of Massage Therapy. The
Yep,
other one is one by Geri, Manual Therapy Exploiting the Role of Human Touch.
yep,
I
yep.
love those papers. So anyone that's listening, I'll see if I can post them in the show notes, or if not, I'll put the titles there. They're great because they do provide a value of touch, but from a different perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
and
know, my new, but I suppose one of the reasons I'm so happy is in my career as an educator and traveling is not because I left PTs and massage therapists behind. That's not why. But the new market, the new field that I teach primarily to is speech pathologists, right? In terms of dealing with voice and swallowing disorders. And the reason I bring that up now is there was a paper from 2019 that a researcher from the University of Utah named Nelson Roy was the lead author on it, where they did a study for looking at muscle tension dysphonia. Muscle tension dysphonia is vocal hoarseness, which since the 1980s has been viewed as due to primarily excessive perilaryngeal muscle tension. Too much tension in the larynx causing a retraction of the larynx against the spine and a reduction in upper and lower movement of the larynx, right? And manual circumlaryngeal techniques are basically going in there and wanking the larynx around to reduce the muscle tension. And they started using it in the 80s. And you know what? There's a remarkable parallel to our shared professions in terms of, you know what, we need to get in there and break this up. And I'm Don Quixote in the speech pathology world or the NT world, et cetera, trying to say, you know what, there's better stories than that. But in 2019, Nelson Roy did a paper where they basically put a person with muscle tension dysphonia, hoarseness, which was said to be due to too much tension here. They slid her in an MRI and had her read a script. Okay, they had to read the script and they watched what happened during the MRI. They noticed that in her brain, the various parts of the brain which showed dysregulated behavior, abnormal brain activity when they compare it to a normal speech pattern, and how her brain was basically misrepresenting things, a dysregulating pattern it's called. And then they pulled her out and they basically wanked her larynx for an hour. But they also do something called tapering, where they'll manipulate the larynx and then they'll lower it because they feel if the larynx is too high, vocal tension is too high, et cetera. So they held the larynx down and then they start the person talking. And if the person can talk with a more normal voice, they'll begin to taper that pressure away to see if the patient can hold it, which is admirable in a way. And it's kind of what I do in my clinic, not just for muscle tension dysphonia. But then what they did, once she was able to hold a voice, they slid her back on the machine and they had to read the same script again. And what they saw was a different brain activity that in an hour's time went from completely or very dysregulated to much more regulated. Now, the study doesn't prove that the problem was here and not here. That's not what the study was set up for or anything like that. But to me, it shows that, okay, even if the problem was partially here and the solution was partly here, how completely a part of it, the brain and central nervous system, was to both the problem as well as the intervention. And to me, that's the kind of studies that we need to be doing in the manual therapies. And somebody could say, well, there's no money for it. Well, these aren't studies funded by big pharma, as people like to put out there when they want to sort of dispel why research is flawed and all that. These are university-based studies. It can be done. I see that as holding up what's possible, in terms of a beacon for all of us to see that, I think we can do better.
We need to do better.
Yeah.
We have to do better. And that's such a great example there, Walt. I really appreciate you sharing that, because oftentimes people hear is like, oh, well, the science hasn't caught up yet, or like no one's.
Oh my God, I'm so sick of hearing that.
Yeah, me too. It drives me nuts, right? Or like, oh, research, there's no money for it or whatever. But you look at, like we were just talking about, I'm sure we could list hundreds of crappy papers that people use to try and support their thing. Like, someone's spending money on garbage to research garbage. Why not do designs like the one you just said for the manual therapy world? Like, there just has to be a will to do it, and there's, for whatever reason, I don't know why. I don't have an answer. Why there's not more like that. There's, I think, a few more coming up, like that Geri paper is from 2019. Bialosky's got his stuff from 2018, 2017, whatever it was. And the cold one you talked about from 2020. And there is some out there, but like, we need more of that stuff to say, look, like, this is, if we want to change how we're thinking and how we're treating people, let's fund it, because this is one thing that I feel very strongly about, and I don't hear talked about a lot, but I think I've seen you comment on this before on, like I said, in our closed Facebook groups, is about the ethics of what people are thinking or what they're being told. So let's use the myofascial example, right? If you feel that you are, your pain, say your low back pain, has resulted from adhered fascia and some emotional stuff, and then you as a fascial therapist go in there and you do the thing and the person gets better, then they're made to believe that their fascia was the problem. But we don't have evidence to support that. I would say that's unethical, and as well as the person's not giving informed consent, as well as also if we're looking at healthcare ethics, there's that the non-maleficence, right? There's the do no harm. Well, how do we know that even though the person might not have experienced physical harm by what we did, there might be that kind of that long term harm that they could feel from being weak or feeling, losing that self efficacy, and I think that that's something that's not talked about enough about the problem with these unsupported narratives.
Yeah. And I think I mean, we can, not just bust on MFR, but you can bust on so many things, including in the exercise-based profession, in terms of the posture people out there, people who feel that they're so incredibly vulnerable and fragile if they don't maintain the posture that someone says they do, or if their core, heaven forbid, got weak, that their back's just going to explode. I mean, talk about fear-based, but then again, that fear is what drives people to continue therapy. So, you know what? There's an ulterior motive there. I have empathy for for myself from the past, seeing that dilemma of being shaken to give it up. And I think, is it totally unethical to continue to pass along what you've been taught? I think there might be a line in there where we can navigate that as long as we realize that just because we were taught it doesn't make it fact, right? And I think ways around it are by using phrasing like, well, some people say that it's your fascia, some people say that it's your posture, some people say that it's your strength, but there's a lot of disagreement on that. I one of my motives is to introduce the concept of uncertainty, not just to my patients, but also to clinicians that I teach. Let them know that, yeah, there's a lot of these popular narratives out there that people take as fact, but yet are really poorly explained. When we were talking before we went on about, I was in BC in 2016 for RMBCT. Am I getting the initials right? For
RMTBC.
There you go. That one for I was a keynote at the 2016 conference, and A.L. Lederman was one of my co-presenters there, and his whole thing, the paper that he wrote on the myth of core stability. You want to talk about lighting some fires on social media? Holy crap! You put out a paper like that, and you're just going to get vilified, and he did. But yet there's so many explanations for all of this, and what I'm trying to do is in my work, in my writing, in my teaching, in my practice, is trying to look at the common denominators. Sure, it might be posture, it might be strength, it might be fascial restriction, it might be trigger point, but what are the common denominators in all there, right? And I think that's where we can go back to Carl Rogers and see maybe it's the relationship that we build is at least one of the major common denominators, or maybe not the only impactful one, because it's almost impossible to say which one it is. If you read, Bialosky's paper and Geri's papers, they're talking about multifactorial explanations for manual therapy impact, but they're not talking about, this, here is the sequence that every intervention follows based on peripheral to central. They're introducing these as potential variables, but there's a lot of wiggle room in there. So my point in this is I don't want to totally stomp on anybody anymore by saying, somebody said it's my fascia. And what I do is at least I validate their beliefs, which isn't that important without being too placating, right? I validate a person's lived experience, and yeah, Eric, it could be your fascia did get restricted, but it could be a holding pattern that your nervous system hasn't let go of yet, which is one of my favorite. Basically, it says everything, it says nothing at the same time, but it moves me past that awkward moment. And if they want to know more, I'll bore the hell out of them, right? But most patients don't.
Yeah.
Most patients want to know that we know what we're doing, but I let them know I know enough about what I'm doing to know that there's more than one way to explain all this. And if you want to know more, we can talk. If you want to know more, I can send you information. But I think it's important is for me as an educator not to totally trash another person's beliefs, even if I don't believe they're not valid, because again, I've not lived their life. And I see a lot of flaws in a lot of things a lot of people believe, including myself. And I don't have all the answers either.
And that's a huge thing too. It says about you as an educator, as a person, is that we don't have the answers. right? We have to have a little bit
Yeah.
a level of kind of humility and be humble and say, yeah, I don't know. I know when I first started teaching, I would say I was too aggressive in calling out the crap,
Me too. Yeah.
because I was just angry. I was frustrated, and now I would assume that probably just listening to what you say, like we use a lot of the same language, you and I, and a lot of the same kind of ways of going about things. And that's the thing I always say too, is about being we have to be comfortable with being uncertain because we don't have all the answers. But if someone comes in, they say this thing, then validate that that's their experience. But let's introduce, if they're interested, maybe a different understanding,
Yeah.
or it's a
Yeah.
more complex or more complete understanding, and maybe that's part of it. And when in all my courses too, like we'll go through, I call it like a skeptical hour. I'm like, tell me the things that you're skeptical about, and people will usually say something with fascia or trigger points or craniosacral, and we'll have a conversation about it, and then we bring it back to like, what's all common about these things from a manual therapy perspective? Well, it's different ways of touch. There are different ways of
Yeah.
hacking into someone's system. So how can one be right and one be wrong? The
Yeah.
story are all different, but how can all these stories, like which one's more right, which one's more wrong? And I found that that brings people more together rather than pushing them back. And we're like, okay, let's talk about how do we do these things to help this person in front of us that's suffering,
Yeah.
rather than competing narratives, which can be confusing for people.
Yeah.
There's nothing worse
And
than a
we,
pain patient who has been told 8 different things,
yeah. Yeah.
and they don't know what to believe. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And you and I have been through enough of this in terms of pain education and all those arguments that happen on social media. And, there's a lot of people who basically dismiss people who are looking at pain as a peripheral thing instead of a central thing and all those things. And we've seen how that goes. And I, I read a paper a number of years ago before I started collecting them, and I wish I could get back to this paper, but I can never find it. So I have to paraphrase it. Basically, it was a study that the researchers wanted to know what was the effect of pain science education on low back pain patients in the physical therapy setting. So what they did was they set it up so the entire intervention was pain education, air quotes, and they did a questionnaire at the beginning, a questionnaire with the patient at the end. And they had basically the script down, if you will. Here's the education we're going to provide to this person about their back pain, about not necessarily being, injured tissue and all those good things, et cetera. And what they found that no matter the quality of the education, most people left the session still with a similar set of beliefs that they came in with, that there was something going on in their tissues. Not that that means we should just give up on it, right? But how much of our effort, how much of our time, how much of our ostracizing or separating ourselves from our patient or our student in the education world, how much of that should be spent, trying to dispel myths, and how much of it could be more maybe productively used, not to lie to people, but realize that a lot of us cling hard to our belief system, and most of us don't let go of it in one session.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to change it in one session.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very rare, and I know from my experiences too that I used to try and give a lot more pain science education because that's what I jumped into when I was like the pendulum, and realized that it didn't work, and it just often made people feel that there was something else wrong with them, that that was maybe their brain or their nervous system that was now the thing that needed
Yeah.
to be fixed rather than the tissue, and so yeah, I don't know what the best answer is. I think it's like anything. It's uncertainty, and it's every individual is different, right? That n equals one thing.
Yeah.
Somebody may want to know all the pain science education stuff, and that might be what works for them. Most people probably don't,
No.
and it's probably they don't care. They just want to feel better, and you know we don't need to waste our time. Like you said, we waste your time spend pain splaining to them is not always the best option. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know for a while though, right? In social media, that was the option. That was like you had to explain. People had to understand. They had to think differently.
Yeah. But even a lot of those pain education resources are being questioned now. Some of the originals from 10 years ago, and even Explain Pain gets a lot of critics in terms of, what they're saying, how they said it, and everything evolves. I look back on the neurodynamic concepts that were introduced that, were viewed as pretty mechanistic. And now, while it's still a valid way of looking at things, they've evolved so much to see that even that, um, it's more complex than a nerve getting trapped within its tunnel, right? And how that is explained from a cause as well as an impact perspective. So, everything evolves. And I'm of the mind that the more I learn, the less of which I'm certain about, right? Which to some people is very disquieting, disconcerting, because the if you come across as not knowing, you're viewed as being ignorant, when in reality, not knowing might be the greatest compliment. You got to pull it off, right? Someone says,
Yeah.
"Well, what do you think it is, Walt?" Just saying, "I don't know," isn't enough. But I think what I do is I'll say, "Well, you know what? There's uncertainty. It could be that fascial problem that someone had told you about, validating their perspective. Or it could be, and here's where you fill in the blank of your favorite narrative, or your variety of narratives. And to me, that gives them the explanation that, okay, there is uncertainty. Even I'm uncertain. Do we need to spend time here trying to figure that out, or can we move into things to work on trying to help you? And that's what I try and do. And try and sort of like slide them slowly, push them along that path. If they want to stay back there, and if they want to talk about or argue about what it is, you know what? If that's how you want to spend your money with me, that's fine. But I think you're here for help, and maybe together, using the combination of those two models and the uncertainty that's within it, let's see if we can come up with something that means something to you. And to me, I'm very different in this world, that I use shared decision making a lot more than is taught and is used, which again seems very much makes people uncomfortable as a clinician, because you're giving up your power in the therapeutic relationship and asking your patient to take a role in that. And it's pretty foreign to a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, the shared decision making, there's a lot of good data out there that supports that it's a good a great approach. Shameless plug here. I just co-authored a paper that went out last year, and it was all about person centered care and shared decision making. And when you go and read through the research, there's a lot out there that says that's kind of the current less wrong way of engaging with people, particularly people that are
Yeah.
suffering. And I would say a lot of the times when there's that uncertainty, because we know, right? Listeners probably hopefully know this too, is that when we're talking about MSK pain, a lot of times we don't know what the causal mechanisms are. People hurt. We could spend
Yeah.
all our time trying to figure it out, or maybe we could just, like you said, we can just try and figure out something that feels good for that person, and that might change from day to day. But spend your time, figuring out and having that conversation, and
Exactly. I have a
that's a
free
better way.
yeah, I have a free 1 hour course on my website on shared decision making in the manual therapy setting. I actually filmed it for a Canadian massage conference a year or two ago, and then just put it up on my website for free. That you know what, it gives information on what it is, and kind of gets over the hurdle of, okay, how can you apply it? Because it's really foreign to me, the way I interpret shared decision making, and I see it part of those three rings of the evidence based practice model, right? Patient preferences and values, and that's it's about giving up ego. It's about saying, if you got a problem in your face here, in your TMJ, we're taught to say, okay, the muscle's too tight, so we need to lengthen it, or whatever that might be, right? But yet that may not feel right to the person. So it's about doing something and then saying, okay, what do you think? Does this feel useful? Does this feel helpful? Does this feel like it might be harmful or a total waste of time? And I tell you what, patients really struggle with it sometimes because they're not used to being asked like that, right? They're not used to be giving input, because they say, "Well, I don't know," right? You're the expert, and it's like, "Yeah, I'm the expert in this stuff, but I'm not the expert in your lived experience. So, what do you think? Does this feel useful?" And that's a really hard one to get through with a patient, even with me in my practice sometimes. But I think it's so worth it to give them the sense that they own this, that they have power and they have contribution to this. Not everybody will participate. In fact, I know that some people stop seeing me because I'm so much work. Um, they bit literally, why are you asking me these questions? Can't you just fix me or help me? Or they want to go and bliss out at my table. It's like, no, that ain't going to work here. And if you want bliss, go somewhere else. If you want someone who doesn't ask you questions to make this more meaningful for your past and present life, go somewhere else. But if you're interested in this, I'll work with you. Right. So that's available for free on my website. So not, there is a shameless plug, but there's nothing to be gained by that, because I think it's worth, I think part of what you and I have gotten into involves some altruistic aspect of sharing, this in order to kind of move this narrative along.
Oh yeah, and it's one thing I always have to come back to with myself is why did I get into this? Why did I start teaching? And it really became a matter of like I'd seen too many people suffer, people close to me suffer, being treated with these kind of tissue based pathoanatomical approaches, and that's what motivated me to start learning more. And I went back to school and did my master's, and I started teaching, and I started really. But then there is a point too where you're like you got to balance. You're teaching with your personal life, and if you want to have a clinical practice, how do you do all these things? You have to make money, right? You have to be money. So how do you do all the things and still maintain that altruism? And but what I always tell clients that come to see me in my personal practice is I say, like, don't ever feel you need me, but I'm here if you require me.
Yeah,
And just
yeah,
one thing I always want people to take my courses to learn too is that, yeah, you're going to pay money for these courses, but hopefully that you do this and it's going to save you time and money in the end, because you're just going to stop chasing all these certifications and all these things that aren't probably that helpful. And maybe the even most important thing is maybe those people that have come to see you that are suffering, maybe now they will suffer a little bit less because
yeah,
you're helping them in a different way. And so, that's the stuff that I get really excited about is when people reach out to me and say, hey, you know what? I took your course a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever, last year or 2 weeks ago, whatever. They reach out and they took a course, they did something, they went changed their practice, and they come back to you and they're like, this has really helped. And you think,
yeah,
thank you. I'm so happy to
yeah.
hear that. Yeah.
I have a saying at the beginning of each class, and I tell people, you came here thinking you're going to learn some nifty hands-on stuff, and I said, I hope you do. But what I really hope you leave here with is the willingness to embrace shared decision making, not just in the work that I'm teaching here, but in all the interventions that you do, whether it's manual therapy or exercise or kind of educational cognitive behavioral type work. And unlike you, became an educator before I transitioned. I became an educator as soon as I left that MFR model, teaching sort of a copycat version, if you will, of MFR. But then that slowly evolved, and my classes changed considerably, and I actually got criticized because I was constantly changing. It's from my previous my previous mentor and employer in helping with his seminars, like somehow change is a bad thing, changing your mind and your story, right? Um, and I'm still learning. Unlike you're a lot younger than me. I'm 63, and I'm finishing up a master's right now because I never got one back then. I got a couple bachelors back in the 80s, but you didn't need a master's to become a PT back then. And now, I'm finishing up my master's, and my final project is basically a survey study on how implementing shared decision making has, changed a person's practice. So that's going to be a fun one once we get that one out there. And you know what? Maybe when I'm 80, I'll have my doctorate done, and we'll do something else on that. But I hope by then that we're not having these conversations of why people are still selling it and why people are still buying it. That those tissue-based, rabbit hole, silo-based, whatever you want to call it, right? Those closed group um, models that are just so darn popular today.
Yeah. I get that you're doing your master's as well as with all your teaching, and you're a busy man.
Yeah,
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 good for you,
yeah,
Walt.
yeah.
One thing I did want to ask you about, and this kind of I think it kind of goes with everything you're saying is because you were part of a, I know you taught for somebody else doing your myofascial stuff, and then you went and you did your Walt Fritz MFR seminars, I believe they're called,
Something
and
like that. Yeah,
you still called them that for quite a long time though, even though you
yeah.
weren't teaching MFR. How did you go about changing that name, and how was that received within your community?
Which community? The MFR community?
I would say the MFR community as well as the people that were learning from you.
Yeah. Well, I would guess that the people in the MFR community said, finally, good riddance, right? Because
Oh,
I was actually encouraged by a lot of them. Well, if you don't believe in it, stop calling it, right? So
right.
for a long time, I was like, back then, I believed it was all about the fascia, right? And then I saw the distinction between MFR as an explanation of what's wrong with somebody, right? Their fascia is restricted, and MFR sort of this brand of thing that we do with our hands. That it's a description of an intervention. And for a long time, I was sort of drawing the line and say, you know what, I don't believe that, a person's problem are solely due to fascia, and that we're somehow, jumping through all these other tissues, or jumping through the skin, as Diane Jacob likes to say, to, attack somebody's fascia. But I was still calling it that, maybe because I didn't want to give up that my blankie, right? Of that security, or that potential market, if you will, of the fascists out there who were still willing to see that. And then finally, after getting the crap beat out of me on social media for about 2 or 3 years by a lot of our shared friends who basically said, stop it, and I was in no mood to stop it, because it was my brand. Finally, during COVID, when nobody had anything to do, I reformatted all of my course curriculums, and I decided that was the time to rebrand away from myofascial release and into manual therapy. And even manual therapy carries along some connotations that I don't necessarily relate to, right? If you mention manual therapy to a physio or a physical therapist, a lot of times they're thinking spinal adjustment, joint manipulation. They're thinking manipulative type therapies. To other people, manual therapy is a completely ambiguous term. I'd love to someday just completely wash myself of even that term and call my work Steve, right? Steve builds absolutely no mindset of, well, what it is that we're doing. And it's like, okay, let's just start right here. This is Steve. We're going to introduce this as a client-centered way of helping people with their problem. I think from people who had taken my courses in the past, most of them were pretty supportive, because I'm guessing the people that migrated toward me, especially during the more recent years, had begun sort of that crossing of the chasm, as they said, on Soma Simple. And, we're seeing me for the kind of the dualist that I was. I called it MFR, but I was really seeing it from a different lens. And, there's always, I can still be an obnoxious person when it comes to my past MFR gurus and everything, and all those, kind of poking the bear and things like that. I'm childish in some ways, but most of it's done in good fun anymore. That you take swipes at people online. It doesn't mean you necessarily don't respect them or don't appreciate what you learn from them. Because I learned a lot from myofascial release, and go into the other rabbit holes, craniosacral therapy, zero balancing, all my past modalities. I learned a lot from that, and I think a lot of it was learning grace with what we do with the patient, learning to come in slowly, learning not to just beat the crap out of people. And I think learning grace was a big thing that I have a lot of gratitude for. And in order to learn critical thinking, I simply had to move on to other sources.
Right. It's interesting that you said that too, about not beating the crap out of people, and that's the thing that, for in a lot of, at least in the massage world that I live in, there's a huge belief. It seems to be the most common one, that if it hurts, if it's harder, you're doing better.
Yeah.
But it's once you understand kind of some of the nociceptive system and the pain experiences and all that neuroscience and neuroimmune stuff that's out there, which we don't need to go into, you realize that approach isn't always the best. But then then you can't say that the light touch approach is always the best either. And that goes to what you said, the shared decision making thing is like, what feels best for you and what's going to work for you. And I would say too that I like that what you said about, you learned a lot of grace, you learned a lot of things from all these other courses and gurus and people you learned from. And I would say the same thing with my own journey as well, is that you take something from each of it, and then it's, you don't throw it away. I mean, a lot of the techniques that I do now look very similar to what I would have done 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But
and I think there's also, from that person-centered perspective, we've got, I'm going to pick two polar extremes. You've got craniosacral therapy and you've got ground and pound. Okay. Fill in the blank, whatever ground and pound is to you. And it's so easy for somebody to say, well, that craniosacral therapy is just fluff and buff, right? If you really have a problem, you got to do ground and pound. But there are people who are genuinely impacted in a lasting positive way from those light touch interventions. And there's people who are genuinely helped from ground and pound, right? To view your modality as being totally accurate for certain kind of disorders is totally missing the boat of person-centered care, because I will not beat the crap out of somebody. I tell my patients a lot of times, I think you're metaphorically looking for the basket of sticks when you walk in my office that you have to bite on while I'm treating you to get rid of the pain, it's like, we're going to take the stick out of your mouth and I'm going to let us decide together. Yep, it is shared decision making. So I make some of these decisions too. And there's times when a patient asks me for more pressure than I appreciate. And there was a time in my career 10 years ago where I said, no, that's not necessary. But I would be missing out on your lived experience, on your expectations, on your belief in your past and present experience. Is it totally wrong to use ground and pound on somebody? Absolutely not, especially if that's what they feel they have the best luck with and that's what's best for them. Just like there's times when a patient challenges me to lighten up to a point where I wonder if I'm doing anything. But if I actually open my ears to what they're telling me, I'm doing something, and that's what I look for. One of my favorite questions when I'm trying to establish shared decision making, when we start touch, is I'll ask them, "Does it feel like I'm doing anything?" Totally vague question, and I let them chew on it, and they struggle with it. Right? Does it feel like we're doing something? I try and make it a we and not a me. Right? And because sometimes we're doing things at levels that I would never know because I'm so stuck in my rabbit hole, I can't appreciate that somebody's living in another rabbit hole just next door, you know?
Yeah. I like that term too. I use that, and when I'm treating people, when I'm in my courses, I often say, is this feeling important, or is this
Yeah.
feeling meaningful, or is this feeling, one, it depends on the day, or, is this feeling helpful, is I think probably the word
Useful. Yeah.
useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is the
Yeah.
term I use. And then another term, which I can't claim, but I heard a colleague say once was, they said, tell me when this feels boring, like meaning like, when do you want me to move on? And that
Yeah.
usually is, and I love that because it puts the power, the control
Oh,
into the
yeah.
person, and not you, and that way they have the decision to say, yeah, like, this is, can you move on? And I find
Yeah.
that that's such a great approach.
Yeah.
And it feels, as a clinician, it feels, what's the word, it feels better, like it feels like you are just like, you're, this person's welcomed you into their world and you are there to help them, rather than you being the all-knowing, therapist. You're just using your skills to try and make them feel better, and it's they have some control of it. And I think that just, it feels so satisfactory. Whereas before,
Yeah.
I would often blame myself or blame the person depending on the day. If they got better, oh, of course it was me. If they didn't, then it was their fault.
Well, PTs do it all the time because you weren't compliant with the 15 pages of exercise I told you to do it four times a day, right? They
Yeah.
set the bar so high, right? Or the other piece of homework is that somehow we know what's best for another human being. I mean, that's a lot of power. And I tell my patient, if this doesn't feel useful, and I don't care whether it's a stretch or it's an exercise, if it doesn't feel useful, let's work on it until it does. I had a shoulder repair about 6 or 7 years ago now. And I went through rehab. My 13-year-old physical therapist, he did a decent job, right? Except it felt like he was doing it, he pulled it out of a file drawer and said, here's your rehab for rotator cuff repair. Right. And I was a horrible patient. I really was, because as soon as he would turn around to do what PTs do, and they're working with a number of people at once, I totally get that. I would go from doing that, okay, the TheraBand's over there and I'm doing that external rotation and I'm thinking, okay, this is really lame. And that skeptical, cynical part of my brain, but I'm realizing I'm doing this, but it's not really making a connection from here to here. It's not really connecting me to my pain or to my weakness or any sense of my experience. So I would go off and I would start wandering and say, "Ooh, there it is right there." Right. And he'd
Yeah.
come back and say, "What are you doing? I told you to do it like this." And I said, "Yeah, but that didn't feel useful. This does." And he really wanted nothing to do with it. So I basically discharged myself pretty quickly and I continued my rehab on my own, bad patient that I am. But now I transfer that to my own patients, whether it's exercise, right? Can you make an exercise truly something that resonates up here and not just something that I tell you is good for you? Can I do, the traditional kind of stretching that we might do with a manual therapy patient or, even education? Can we make this resonate with you? And to me, that's part of my embodiment of shared decision making.
And that's crucial. And what you say makes so much sense. And I'm always curious. So people hear that, and you're like, oh, that sounds so logical. It makes so much sense. But because of how our foundations of our educations, whether it's PT or massage or chiro or any type of manual therapy, we don't learn that way. So it's like learning a new language.
It
So,
is. It is.
and that's what I find too, is you can talk to people, they get it, they're like, this makes so much sense. They go back into practice, and then it's, oh, this is confusing. I don't have any teddy bear to hold on to, so therefore I'm just going to go and do what I've always done.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, I think, is that knowledge translation to changing clinical practice is very difficult. And I don't know what the best answer is for that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I just think it takes an evolution over time. I think that as new grads have come up, I hope that the education system is improving, because how many times have you read on social media somebody justifying what they do because that's what they were taught in massage school or PT school? It's like big hairy deal. That doesn't mean anything, right? And then, then you're calling into question somebody else's past expert, and I totally get that, right? And hopefully our educational standards are continuing to rise. The physical therapy profession in the United States is a doctoral profession, but that doesn't mean people are learning, completely, on the truth narratives, right? They're still learning a lot of crap. They're still passing on to patients that the reason you're having pain is because you're weak. That if you get strong, you'll have less pain, as if that's the transition right there from weak to strong is the reason why exercise works. And I think my profession does a lousy job of letting them know it's much more complex than that. Just like it's much more complex than, your masseter is too tight. That's why you're having TMJ pain. And I just think those stories, they're always going to be popular because patients love those simple stories. And then we like telling simple stories, so we please our patients. And it also takes up less of our time so we can get on to things that matter. When in reality, the elevator speech for telling somebody that pain is more complex than just weakness or tightness, it doesn't take long to add just a little bit more to that, to let someone know that there's a lot more to it than just that little snippet that you read on Facebook or that even your doctor told you. Um, I think it's going to take an evolution, and I'll be gone by that time before education really steps up to the plate. But let's face it, you know what? I guess education is always going to be slightly behind a groundbreaking type of evidence and viewpoints. That's just I've kind of accepted that, and we move on however we can.
Do you have any plans to retire anytime soon, Walt? Sounds like you're on.
No, I can't afford it. Can't
No.
afford it, man. No, I just totally enjoy at least what I'm doing right now. The book came out. I'm working on my master's. This whole thing with the speech pathology is just like I feel like I just graduated from school again, because it's a new world with me, and I'm getting a chance to work with I'm getting a chance to work with dental hygienists, right, who are doing myofunctional based work, which is so different than things that I learned. I'm working with vocal coaches who are working with elite level performers that you've heard of, right? They're traveling around the country with. I'm working with speech pathologists, working with head neck cancer, post radiation work, with all these different things, which just, I mean, they get me up in the morning and make me want to come into work again. So I don't have any plans to retire for a while. And my wife is pretty good with my rather robust international schedule. She comes with me. We're going to Athens, Greece next week to teach a class there, and fun stuff. I love teaching in Rochester, New York, near where I'm at, and I like teaching. I'm teaching in Taiwan in January, and I love that stuff. So no, I don't have any plans. So if you're waiting to take my place, get in line.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was great. And why don't you just give listeners a little plug about how to get in touch with you and your contact, and
Yeah,
I'll make
the
sure
easiest way is waltfritz.com. It's pretty easy to find me. And I'm on social media with a big mouth on all sorts of places, so I'm pretty easy to find there. I have live classes. I have online classes. I have an online class that I put together. It's pretty much for massage therapists, called the whole body class, that covers the shared decision making model from head to toe. Yes, it's done from an MFARTS type perspective, at least when you watch it with your hands, of what's going on, but it's very different from how the engagements work. I have a lot of shorter courses, a couple free classes on there, to not just to kind of get you in the funnel, but basically as standalone ways to learn more about all the weird stuff that I'm talking about. I also, I'd made it a practice to make myself available when people have questions, concerns, problems, and they're really struggling. Because I look back at those Soma Simple days, and I find people like Diane Jacobs who were so giving with their time, to be patient with me, and I'm kind of giving back to the community in a similar way. So if you have any questions, don't ever hesitate to reach out to me as an email or on social media.
Lovely, Walt. Well, thanks for being here today, my friend, and we will connect soon, okay?
Yeah, and thanks for doing the good work that you're doing. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe so you can be notified of all future episodes. Purpose First is available on all major podcast directories. If you enjoyed this episode, please share on your social media platforms. If you'd like to connect with me, I can be reached through my website, ericpurvis.com, or send me a DM through either Facebook or Instagram at ericpurvisrmt.